Figuring out what the best cinema camera to invest in is one of the hardest decisions for filmmakers these days, and depending on who you ask, you might get a totally different answer. But for me, this topic has gotten personal because for the last couple of weeks, I've been in negotiations with a client who refuses to shoot with my $10,000 FX9 because they don't think it's good enough for their show. Now, at first I wanted to argue, but then I realized I didn't actually know if they were right or not. So I did the logical thing and rented around $250,000 worth of cinema cameras and lenses to try and figure out what's worth it and what's not. In this video, I'm going to compare these 4 cameras, including the $3,000 FX3 that you can get over the counter at Best Buy, the workhorse $10,000 FX9, the $25,000 Burano, and the nearly $100,000 Alexa 35 that's behind some of the biggest movies in the world. Afterwards, I'm going to sit down and do a blind review of the footage from all 4 cameras and see if I, as a professional cinematographer, can actually tell which is which or whether they all just look the same and it's overblown marketing hype. And finally, I'm going to break down the pros and cons of each of these camera systems and then give my verdict on which of them I'd actually invest in as a working DP who needs to use their gear out in the real world in dynamic environments. So I've been a Sony shooter for pretty much my entire film career. The very first big camera I bought was an FS5, then a few years later an FS7, and now the FX9 is my main work camera with the FX3 as a B cam. Over the years of mostly specializing in docs, I've used a lot of Canons as well, and sometimes the odd Red or ARRI, but for the most part, the documentary industry has been a Sony show for a while now. But for the last few months, I've been going back and forth with a new client about working as the series DP for a multi-part doc series they're producing, and we keep having the same argument. They think Sony looks terrible, like very TV feeling video, and they only want to shoot on ARRI cameras. Now, for a while, whenever I've had this kind of situation come up, my default response has been, with a good lens and colorist, you'll never tell the difference. But then I realized I didn't actually know if this was true or not. Maybe there is such a crazy difference between them that it makes sense to deal with all the headaches and the insane price tag that comes with buying into the ARRI world. But this also has more real world relevance for me because lately I've noticed that my FX9, which I bought secondhand more than 4 years ago now, I think, it's starting to give me some weird power issues, like it's been turning itself off randomly and I can't figure out why. Both of my previous cinema cameras died because of power issues, and with all the crazy places I take my cameras to, like bat caves or on Arctic rivers or something, it's not really surprising that moisture is the first thing to get in there and fry the circuits. So even though it's not critical, I'm expecting that within a year or so I might have to start thinking about my next camera system, which means I'm especially interested in how all these cameras stack up. Now, as a rule, I always try and spend as little as necessary on my cameras, and I always buy secondhand when possible, but that doesn't mean I won't shell out for something if it's the best possible tool for the job. Like if the Alexa blows me away or the Burano clearly outshines the FX9, I'd at least be open to thinking about the upgrade. On the other hand, if my little FX3 looks almost the same, then I'm much more likely to stick with the mid-range cameras I've been using for a while and keep telling future clients that they'll never notice the difference. So the plan here is to run the cameras through a couple different challenges to test them in real world shooting scenarios to see how they handle things from, yes, a technical perspective, but beyond raw image quality, I'm gonna be trying to figure out how they handle, like what they're actually like to operate off of a soundstage, and then a bunch of other practical things, because raw image quality is great and all, but I wanna know what it would be like to actually own and operate these kinds of cameras. By the time we're done, I'm hoping to have figured out the pros and cons of each of these cameras, and then ideally have a clear idea of what camera I'm going to be investing in next, until something new drops in a couple of months and I change my mind completely. So I'll just get these cameras up on the tripod and we can start the first test. So we're just getting set up for our first test here, but really quickly before people freak out, I know the ARRI is the better camera in many ways, from the design and the lifespan and a whole bunch of other things. I'm not expecting the FX3 to be a better camera, but that isn't the point. I want to know what the better camera is for actually owning and using for me, someone who works with smallish crews, I travel a ton, and I put my gear in some pretty weird situations. Sharpness charts and chromatic aberration tests don't really mean anything to me in my world, and I'm guessing a lot of other non-union run and gun filmmakers feel the same. And so before you start commenting about all the reasons why I don't understand this camera, just realize that I'm doing this comparison for that kind of filmmaker, not Roger Deakins' camera team or something. If you work in certain parts of the industry, there probably isn't any choice involved because it's just assumed you're gonna shoot with an ARRI. But for normal people, there's more to think about when looking for a new camera. Okay, so disclaimer over, this first test is about putting each of these sensors to the test one by one to see how they hold up under extreme lighting conditions. The FX3 says it has 15 plus stops, whatever that means, but what does that actually mean when compared to the 17 stops that ARRI claims? So the idea is to set these cameras up to fail by shooting a super high contrast, terribly lit frame to see how much latitude they have in post for a colorist to work with. So I'm gonna start with the Alexa and then work my way down in price towards the FX3. I'm gonna use the same 32mm Cooke S4 mini lens to keep everything the same, and then I'll work on it a bit in post to see which one held up the best. Oh, and to keep things consistent, I'm gonna be using this small HD Ultra 5 monitor using the false color overlay to make sure we're exposing each camera the same way, and for me personally, the small HD does this in a way that's easiest to understand. Because even if using 4 different cameras in one day isn't really normal, it is pretty common for me to get hired to shoot things on other people's gear, and being able to have a reliable reference monitor helps a ton. Like as we go through each of these different cameras today, the stock monitors are all super different, and if you aren't used to how they behave, you could get confused. Like the Alexa 35's monitor is incredible, and the Burano's monitor is okay, but noticeably worse, and the FX9 monitor is just pretty much bad, with the FX3's being borderline too small to trust sometimes. By having a monitor that you do trust, you can move between camera systems as you need, as long as you bring it with you, so it ends up being a pretty versatile piece of kit. Now I know they're expensive, and I don't want the answer to all filmmaking problems to always be spend more money, but with something like this, it's kind of true. If you have something like a small HD, you know it's giving you accurate results, which might not matter for everyone, but for me it definitely does, and it should make this test a little more accurate. So the idea behind the first test is to shoot an incredibly high contrast scenario. It kind of pains me to shoot a frame this ugly, but it's going to be really interesting to see how this holds up in post. Like if I get it into Resolve, how much of that window can I bring back down? So I'm just going to roll a few seconds of each of these frames, switch cameras, put the same lens on the next camera, shoot the same frame again, and then we'll move on to the next test. That's pretty heavy. This is hilarious. Ka-chunk! This tiny, oh fuck. I don't know if we can get the Cooke on here.
Yeah, you have to, oh, sorry. Yeah, you have to attach the tripod plate to the Cooke, to the lens itself.
Oh.
Wow.
Alright, so this next test is almost the opposite of the first one. I want to see how these cameras look under ideal, controlled lighting conditions. For me, as a doc DP, that's most common when shooting interviews, so a few days ago I set up a bunch of lights in a friend's restaurant and then cycled all these cameras through the same position using a 65mm S4 mini lens and trying as hard as I could to get the framing consistent. This was kind of hard because each camera has a slightly different size sensor, but I think we got it close enough that it's not going to give it away entirely. Honestly, they all look good in these conditions though, so it's going to be interesting to see if we can spot any difference at all in the final image once it's been converted to 709. We'll just have to wait and see, I guess. But the last test for us today has less to do with the technical abilities of the camera and more to do with practicality. What are they actually like to shoot with as an operator without an AC on standby to grab the camera between takes? I can really feel that. I've just been standing here for 2 minutes. This is why I make fun of all the people on sets, but after every single take, they're just like, oh. Okay, so for the last test, we've got the camera outside because for me personally, one of the most important parts of the job is to be able to actually follow characters around as they move through their environment. In documentaries, there isn't really any blocking and you're not working with actors, so the majority of situations I'm in require me to just sort of react to what people are doing and then cover the scene to the best of my ability. So for this one, it's not about outlier technical tests. I want to see what this is like from an operator standpoint. So I'm going to get each camera up one by one and then put it in some different shooting positions, give you my first impressions of the camera physically, and then we're going to do some test shots of following a character through a moving location, so down this sort of dark alley, just to see what it's like to actually have it on your shoulder and working. We'll start with the Alexa, obviously. My very first impression is that it is very heavy. I shoot in two basic positions. I like to cover scenes from down here, and then when the camera's moving or when I need to change the eye level, I'll come up to my shoulder here. So between this and this, and I can usually do that pretty easily for a very long time. I can hold this for, an hour if I need to with the FX9. But even after a few minutes of this, I can see why film people are always handing the camera off to an AC as fast as possible. This is very heavy, and I know the lens and everything has a lot to do with that, but this is, believe it or not, very minimally rigged. On a big set, you'd probably have a whole bunch of other accessories like a rangefinder and remote follow focus and all sorts of other stuff, time code boxes. This is stripped down, and this is really, really heavy. It's insanely well made. Like, the craftsmanship is undeniable. You can tell every single piece on this is like the very best at what it does. Even the way the handle connects with one screw is very Apple-esque in terms of just being beautifully designed. But I guess that's what you get with a $90,000 German camera. Apart from that, as an operator, I really like this monitor system. It's much, much better than the ones that come with the other cameras, like we'll see in a bit. And the eyepiece works really well, and there's really no complaints there. I think it's very well made, but I kind of would expect that out of this camera. Ari also doesn't put tripod threads on the bottom of the camera, so you have to add this big plate. And then this is the shoulder adapter they sell with that plate, which I guess makes it a little more comfortable because there's a cushion, but again, it just adds a bunch of weight, which I'm just going to keep coming back to because that's the main thing. If you are not inside a controlled location, or if you have to shoot long takes, this is going to be really, really difficult. An easy rig would help, but that's still going to be a very, very taxing day. Some documentary scenes run for hours. You could be shooting for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours a day handheld, and day after day this would break me down really fast. But on the flip side of that is the construction, which I have total confidence that this thing is just going to keep working and working and working, and I will never doubt its build quality. Those are my first impressions. Not great from a documentary point of view, or really for anyone who can't hand the camera off a lot or works almost completely off of a tripod. If your job is almost all tripod based, then everything I said just goes out the window. Or if you have the ability to just say, hey, take this for me because you're working in very controlled takes, then this would be doable. But 8-hour shooting day, this would be murderous. So I'll turn it on and we'll do a test shot with Hank down the alley and see how we feel. I will say that from a documentary point of view, this camera takes an insanely long time to boot up. I'm gonna say 15 seconds nearly, around there. And if you've ever been shooting sort of real world stories, the amount of times you're sort of relaxing with the camera down and suddenly you notice something is happening that's really relevant, it happens a lot. And then you got to reach for the camera, turn it on, and try and get the tail end of it. With a 15-second boot up, you might as well not try, and it's going to cause you to not even go for the camera in some situations, whereas the other cameras with their quicker boot ups might be a more useful tool in that scenario. Next up, we're going to take a look at the Burano, and of all the cameras that we tested, I was most interested in this, mostly because it's sort of advertised as their top of the line documentary camera, so I kind of wanted to see if it was for me. And just from a physical standpoint, the shape is different. It seems, it's shorter than the FX9. It seems a little less purposefully designed to be off the shoulder, but it still fits on there pretty nicely, and the monitor gets out in front of you. Build quality is great. Switches are amazing. Boot up time is like 2 seconds, so for dock cameras, that's an amazing feature. Let's do a couple shots with it and see how it handles. You know, it's fits comfortably here. It's easy enough to transition. It's not so heavy, but it is a good chunk of metal. Even though I keep talking about how heavy it is, it's definitely a lot lighter than the Alexa. I don't know in terms of poundage, but I can just feel it on my arms. There was immediately less fatigue and strain. We'll do a couple shots up and down the alley, and then later on, we'll do a deeper dive into all the sort of quirks of this camera and how I think about it in terms of my upgrade path moving forwards. It's kind of a random nerd thing, but they changed the ND instead of being in fractions like on all the other Sony cameras. It's actually in hard stops, which is a much more logical way for a cinematographer to think about ND. So that's pretty cool. Seems like they are at least thinking about the pro market. Okay, up next is my personal camera, the FX9 that I've had for about 4 years now. I don't have too much to say because I use it every day, but like, you know, the weight difference is kind of insane. You know, I do have it stripped down quite a bit. I took off all that metal stuff and the cage pieces and the shoulder pad. And if I was using any of the other cameras, that's probably how I'd operate it too. I'd just try and keep it as low weight as possible. But even so, I do think the difference is pretty noticeable. Also, the form factor of this camera is longer out the back, which means it sits further back on my shoulder, which gets the monitor further away, which is a little more comfortable. I will say that the stock monitor that comes with this is just not good at all. So this is how I run it all the time with the external monitor. This one, again, is the small HD. So apart from the weight, it has all the professional features I generally need, like the variable ND, which is fantastic, the timecode ports, the SDI in, and the audio XLR inputs that are in the body of the camera, which is super useful. But just, you know, generally speaking, I can run this thing all day. To sit there with that on my hip is really quite comfortable. I can do it one-handed. I can pick up the entire camera with one arm pretty easily. Significant difference. But yeah, FX9, what is there to say? It's a workhorse. It's become sort of a staple of the unscripted television world because it's affordable, it's lightweight, and it works really well. So the last one for today is the Sony FX3, and definitely the smallest and lightest of all the cameras by a long shot. Bit crazy to have this massive front heavy lens on the front of it. It still works, it's very comfortable. If I had to hand hold this thing all day, I know from experience that this is a real bicep burner. One of the biggest drawbacks of cameras like this is that you can't easily get it onto your shoulder, and you know, there isn't a position like resting it on your hip that you have for the other cameras. So you kind of have to hold it out here. You can hold it as close to your body as you can, but it's still sort of an unnatural stress position. So I love the FX3 and I use it all the time as a B camera, but as an A camera for following scenes like this, it might not be my first go-to. But with all that said, what's not to love about this camera? It has amazing image quality, really nicely built. I've beaten mine up so badly and been so cruel to it, but it still keeps on working, and that's the kind of thing I really, really like. So yeah, love the FX3. Let's bang off a couple final follow shots and see how it compares to the others. So now that I've had hands-on time with all the cameras, what do I think? And before I say any of this, I still haven't looked at the raw footage yet, so maybe I'm gonna change my mind once I see just how incredible these cameras look. But from the last couple of days of shooting with them, I think I have a pretty good idea of what will and won't work for me. And again, all of this is based on what I do, which might not be the same as what you do. With all that said, let's first start by knocking off the cameras that I know 100% will not work for me right now. And the first is definitely the Alexa, I'm sorry to say. There's so much to love about this camera, from the incredible build quality and the precision and the textures and the fact that these things have a very long life cycle. It's all a really great experience, and I have no doubt that it's going to create some world-class images. But there's a reason most people rent these on a case-by-case basis, and it just doesn't really make sense for a lot of filmmakers' needs. For starters, it's too heavy to operate for long days and weeks on end without a support team to help you. On top of that, it's going to blow up your budget and make traveling way harder. Everything here is also proprietary, like all the little parts and the accessories. Everything is made by Ari, and it's specially made just for this camera, and it costs a small fortune. There was even this little dongle thing for the monitor that I think my friend tried to replace and said it cost $800. So when you work with an Ari workflow, it interrupts everything about how documentaries and run and gun crews kind of operate. And even though it is a great camera and probably the best camera in the world in a lot of ways, it's not the best camera for me. So thanks, Ari. Look forward to using you on specific situations, but you're not going to be my #1 camera. And then next, I'd also discount the FX3 as an 8-cam solely because of the form factor. In a lot of ways, this is an amazing camera, but it's just too hard to get up on my shoulder and to get it set up with the audio handle and the external monitor and a bunch of other accessories that you need to get great coverage. It starts to get a little bit unwieldy. Plus, I would miss the internal ND a lot. I use my FX3 all the time, but it's not the right fit for a main shooting camera right now anyways. So I love this thing, but as an 8-cam, sorry. So then the question becomes a little more interesting, and it's kind of a toss-up between the FX9 and the Burano. And the FX9 has been an incredible workhorse of a camera for me, and there's really nothing I want to change about it, other than maybe to add the same internal stabilizer and then make the variable ND even stronger. Apart from that, the form factor, the versatility, the ability to shoot Super 35, the relatively light weight, the audio options, and the low price, again, I'm speaking relatively here, it all combines to make a sturdy, dependable camera with a good looking picture. But the Burano still kind of has me interested because even though it's a weird camera in a lot of ways, it has some quirks and there are a lot of things that need firmware updates to fix, like the strange inability to see basic camera information through an SDI monitor, meaning you always need the stock monitor right now, which is obviously really dumb. It also reportedly has some weird color issues and a pretty bad rolling shutter, but I haven't run into either of those being a problem yet. And that's just the thing. I haven't shot with this camera enough to know whether or not it would be a good investment or not. But I'm hoping to change that sometime pretty soon because I think there is a lot of potential here. What I have been able to figure out though, even after just a few days, is that this camera was made for professional use. The switches and the buttons and everything, it just really works well. On top of that, the boot up time is like 2 seconds. Those might sound like really unsexy benefits, but they're not if you're using the camera for 10 hours a day for like weeks on end like I do. Because the one thing I do know for sure is that the image quality is going to be good, at least good enough for me. In a second, we're going to get it on the computer and see how good it is compared to an Alexa, but I already know it's good because the FX9 is already good enough. I'm not likely to shoot this camera in 8K very much, but I am really likely to need a sturdy camera with professional inputs that has a tough exterior and makes a great looking image. And this ticks all those boxes on paper. This rental unit is rigged up with a bunch of cages and accessories and stuff I don't really want, but since it's not mine, I don't really want to take it off either. But I do think that once I strip it down a little bit more, the weight is going to feel a lot more comparable to the FX9, even though it will be a bit heavier, I'm sure. Just right now it feels a lot heavier, and I'm not sure how much heavier it is once I get rid of all this stuff. If they're able to work out some of the weird bugs via firmware as well, I think it's very possible that I could be shooting more and more on these. If I had to choose between them right now, like gun to my head, I'd have to probably go with the FX9, but only because it's just plug and play with all my other stuff. But I'm not actually thinking about what camera I want right now. I'm trying to figure out what camera I'm going to buy in a year or so when this one breaks. And I think based on the footage we see next, there's a very good chance it might be time for a change. So let's get on the computer, see how this looks. I'm gonna bring my girlfriend in to act as an ordinary person who's not into cinematography at all, just to see what the average viewer thinks of the footage. And I think it's gonna be really interesting to see if I can pick out one over the other. So yeah, let's get up there and see how it goes. So we're back home and we've uploaded all the footage and just dropped a basic Rec 709 LUT on top of it, conversion LUT. And then we're gonna have a look at all three of these tests. This is Vivian. Vivian is not a film expert, is that right?
Correct.
Vivian is not in the industry. She doesn't care about cameras. She doesn't nerd out about any of this stuff. So I'm just gonna get her spot reaction to each of our tests, see if she thinks, just as a casual observer, does anyone look better? We're gonna run through each of them, and we're looking on both the laptop and the TV. The laptop looks better than the TV to the naked eye, but people will be watching on a TV, so I wanted to see on both. So we'll get her first impressions, and then I will give my much nerdier analysis on which camera I think is which. And then afterwards, we'll have a look and see if I guessed right, if I could pick out the Alexa versus the FX3, and if there really is a big difference. I'm kind of predicting that I'm going to be wrong a bunch of the time, at least half of the time. So yeah, this is gonna be an interesting test. So the very first setup here is Hank sitting in front of this window, and we did this as a dynamic range test. So the face is theoretically exposed for 70 IRE in the monitor. So they were all sort of exposed the same way. And after bringing down the highlights and applying a Rec 709 light, this is what they look like. Now to me, I see a pretty big difference. What do you think right off the bat? Which one looks the best?
Well, camera B, I can see the trees in the background. It's not as overexposed.
Exactly. This one to me, if camera B isn't the Alexa, then there's a huge problem. So yeah, that's like night and day difference. You can see all those details. So if you were shooting in a really dark environment with a blown out window behind you and exposing properly for skin tones, only one of these cameras is gonna be able to recover those. Camera B has gotta be the Alexa. And if it's not, there's a massive problem. Which one do I think is the worst? I think camera D is the worst, but that might be the grade. It looks like, so I'm gonna guess cam B is the Alexa, cam A is the Burano, and then these two to me are almost identical. I'll guess D is the FX3 and C is the FX9.
I'll guess the opposite to be different.
I'll guess exactly the opposite. All right, the big reveal. Burano, Alexa, FX3, and FX9. Did I get that right? I don't know if I got the bottom two right. I was right about the top two. Yeah, that's pretty obvious. And that does make sense because the Alexa has whatever, 16 or 17 stops of dynamic range. The Burano has one less, and then these two have one less than that. So it makes sense that we're getting a little bit more details. So pretty accurate, actually. I thought I was gonna be wrong. And to a normal viewer, that looked much better to the naked eye. So if you were working with massive sets and you were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a day and had a bunch of people involved and you wanted the absolute most range for coloring, Alexa is way better. Second setup. Okay, so these are 4 sit-down interviews. Okay, already the difference is much less noticeable for me. I wish I'd had him wear the same yellow shirt. I guess he got hot and took it off. Is anything jumping out at you?
I think camera A is the Alexa, and that's not based off of anything.
Do you think camera A looks the best?
Yeah, I'm going by gut feeling here.
What is it that's speaking to you about that?
I wouldn't be able to say. I have no idea.
So just blind test, it's camera A, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so this is camera A. I feel like this one's pretty pink and the shadows are pretty noisy, which is typical of an Alexa. The shadows are also kind of noisy here, but I think the skin looks better here. Camera C, the shadows look the best, definitely look the best.
I might change my answer to C.
And D, it looks greenish and with quite a bit of sort of color in there. All right, let's look at the side-by-sides. I think camera C handled the shadows the best. To me, it's a toss-up between C and B. I think C looks the best because the shadows are very clean. There's not a lot of grain. Like if we look at A, see how all this stuff is shifting and grimy in the background? Can you see that? And then here, it's softer. It's just only nerds can see this. You're not seeing it.
I'm not seeing it in this one.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with C is the Alexa. It just looks cleaner and I like the skin. And D one more time. Yeah, that's super green, really punchy. Okay, so can I go 2 for 2? I'm gonna say C is Alexa, the B is the Burano, and then between A and D. All right, I'm gonna say A is the 9 and D is the 3. I actually saw someone do a test like this and didn't get any of them right, and I feel like I can see this one. Ooh. So I was right about 50% of them. It was the Alexa. The FX3 was the one I liked second best. I was right which one was the 9. Well, Alexa definitely looked the nicest again here as well. So I might have to eat my words. I've been telling people for the longest time that it doesn't really matter if you just have a really good colorist, that all the cameras are kind of the same.
I think to the average person though, all of these are the same.
Yeah, you're probably right. All right, so this is the final test. This is just a standard walking shot outside in sort of ideal lighting conditions. This one I think is going to be the hardest to guess because there's just no extreme conditions to test it by, but these all look really similar. Okay, now we'll go through them one by one. Camera A. This is the one I think I like the least.
I was gonna say the same thing.
Were you?
Well,
How come?
it looks the worst.
Just got into it?
Just looks
Yeah,
the worst.
okay, good. I had that same feeling.
I thought B and D looked the best.
B and D were your faves? I think I kind of agree. Okay, so all 4. All right, so I definitely think A looks the worst. Which camera that is, I don't know. Because of price, I'm inclined to say A is the FX3, but that could be totally wrong. I'm gonna say B is the Alexa. I don't really know how the Alexa behaves with colors though. I thought the Alexa was a bit greener normally, whereas B looks not so green. So I might be wrong. I think B looks the best. So I'll say B is the Alexa, A is the FX3, D is the Burano, and C is the FX9. That's gonna be my guess. This one isn't really, this was more of a ergonomics test to see what it was like carrying each of the cameras. But it is kind of interesting that once you get into really uncontrolled midday lighting, maybe it gets a little bit harder to tell. I don't know what that information tells us, but
To me, D looks the crispiest.
that might be just the frame it's stuck on though. There's not a lot of movement. All right, so what did I say? B Alexa, A3, C, C9, and D Burano. Wrong. The Alexa was the one I thought looked the worst in this test. And the FX3 I thought looked the best, and I still think it looks the best. Huh, I was wrong about every camera. Every single one I was wrong here, and I inverted the best and the worst. So that's pretty interesting. I don't really know what that tells us, but at least we know that in a lot of lighting conditions, there really is a noticeable difference with the Alexa, and it is going to give you a lot more latitude and range. Thank you, Vivian. That was helpful. That was interesting for me. I hope it was also interesting for you. I am gonna run the same test over Zoom with Hank. I sent him this file, so I'm really curious to see if he did about the same as me or what he found. And he's a bit more on the nerdy side, so let's jump on Zoom and see what Hank has to say. So I'm sitting here with Richard Carey, who is a former camera assistant and a good friend of mine, who's now busy doing his own stuff out there in the world. And I just wanted to get one more look on this. I found the last exercise sitting there with Vivian really interesting for myself, and I just really wanted to get another camera nerd's perspective on this footage. So yeah, Rich, I just sent Rich the same blind material that I had. He has no idea which is which. Right off the bat, as a sort of someone who deals with cameras full-time professionally, do you think you knew which was which each time?
Not all of them. I think the first one I've got the best shot, I think.
The first one feels obvious.
First one feels obvious, but I don't know. I could definitely be surprised.
So let's just do this. I'm gonna pull up. Okay,
And
what do you see?
Use the best. So like right away, the biggest difference is the highlights in the background. So, you know, shooting an indoor scene with a window is a great dynamic range test. So yeah, so you would expect the camera B to be the Alexa 35, and then it becomes a bit more of a close race after that. You've got a bit more detail in camera A, so thinking the Burano for camera A. And then you got a bit of a toss-up. I'm gonna say camera D is the 9 and C is the It's the 3.
All right, I like it. Drum roll. Alexa Burano FX9
Whoa,
FX3.
yeah.
100%. Yeah, it is pretty interesting. That extra dynamic range. You can definitely see if you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and you've got 50 people there, you know, on set, and it really matters. You need everything out of it. There is a difference. Moving on.
Oh, this one's gonna be hard.
All the interview frames.
Well, here we don't have the benefit of having a, blown out highlights, so we can't quite see that. You've got it all lit and matched pretty well. I mean, they look pretty similar. I feel like the contrast on the face in Cam C is it's a bit more contrasty. I mean, on this one, I'd be choosing essentially at random. I think the only one is Cam C that looks like it stands out quite a bit.
So you're saying Cam C is your favorite?
Cam C, no, I would think that would be a weaker one.
Okay, so Cam C is the worst. Which one are you calling the best?
I'll say D for the Alexa.
D is the Alexa, and C is the worst, which makes it
it's 3.
Yeah, FX3. And then these two, complete toss-up.
Complete toss-up. I mean, but to be honest, they're all so close. Yeah, I'm not
sure.
All
right, let's have a look. Nope.
Oh,
the Alexa was your least favorite.
Yeah, I guess I pointed out the one that wasn't a Sony camera.
The thing about the Alexa is if you know you need the Alexa, then you're not thinking about, there aren't any other choices, right? But for most people, these other 3 cameras are the better choice. Okay, so this third one, this one I did as an ergonomics test almost more than anything. I didn't expect to learn much about raw image quality. It was just sort of like what it was like to carry and hold and operate. But this is the one I was completely wrong on. I don't know, are you seeing anything?
Yeah, I mean, right away there's like for sure a color difference. So like camera A looks pretty magenta on that, especially on that left wall. Maybe in like sort of green cast in camera B. And maybe I'm not the best judge of resolution here, so I'm just looking at the color.
Sharpness changes frame to frame, right?
Yeah. I think I like camera B
the most,
but I can't really explain why. Like it just has like a pleasing sort of like blur to it or something. It could be the colors even. Like that one seems to stick out quite a bit, like with the color cast. I'm gonna say that one's the Alexa. I'm gonna say camera B is Alexa.
He's your favorite.
Yeah, I think so.
Which is your least favorite?
It's so subjective, but I think just because it stands out a little bit, it looks a bit different from the other ones. A is the Burano, and
the Burano, okay.
D is the 9, D is the 3.
The 3 was your favorite.
3 is the favorite, eh?
The Alexa was the Burano. I mean, I also picked I was wrong about all of them, and I picked the FX3 as my favorite as well. I mean, it's so hard to know. These tests are not scientific, but it is interesting that both you and I were like, I like that one, even though I can't tell why. I also thought it was the Alexa. Anyways, thanks, man. I appreciate it. And we will see you out there sometime soon, I hope.
Thanks, man. Pleasure.
All right, later. All right, so if you're still with me at this point, it's been a pretty interesting series of tests. I know none of them are overly scientific, but I'm not really interested in what results I can get in a lab or against a sharpness chart because I don't really know what any of that stuff means for real world applications anyways. So I just wanted to see what these cameras were like in conditions I might actually shoot in and what it would be like to operate these cameras in the field. And my takeaways sort of surprised me. First off, I'm gonna have to stop saying that you can't tell the difference between ARRI footage and other cameras because you actually can. The dynamic range is legitimately noticeable when you're shooting in tough lighting conditions, and the super clean shadows did make me a bit jealous. Now, the fact that no one could pick out the Alexa in an uncontrolled follow shot and that I actually thought it looked the worst of them all is interesting too, but that's not really what it was made for. So I can totally see now why you'd want this camera for shooting a feature film or a commercial where you're controlling the environment and shooting like contained scenes, because you just want the very best image quality you can get so your colorists can do their thing. But like Rich and I were talking about, if you actually need a camera like the Alexa 35, you probably already know that and aren't seriously considering anything that doesn't say ARRI on the side, except maybe the Sony Venice or the occasional top-end Red. So I'm kind of eating my words a bit here because it really is a beautiful sensor. But would I actually buy one or even ask to rent one on my shoots? No, almost never. For certain types of high budget doc work, like ones where the interviews are the most important thing and there isn't much verite coverage, then yeah, maybe. But for all the remote, rugged, run and gun type stuff that I personally like to shoot the most, it's just too heavy, it's too expensive, and needs too many proprietary bits for it to make sense. Plus it absolutely chews through batteries, which makes it pretty impractical for small crew travel stuff. I definitely have a new respect for the Alexa after this, but unless someone forces me to use it, it's not for me right now. The other cameras weren't as much of a surprise, as I'm already pretty used to Sony stuff, but the Burano was the one that made me the most curious. Now maybe the pure image quality didn't jump out at me like the Alexa did, but a lot of arguably more important stuff did. The build quality, the fact that it takes like 2 seconds to turn on, it's got great battery life, the handling, the internal ND, and yes, the massive resolution that I'll probably never use, but just overall there's a lot going on with that camera that's relevant for the kind of work I do. The Burano doesn't get a lot of love on the internet, but I think that's mainly because it's not intended to be a camera for an FX3 or FX6 style shooter, so when those people get their hands on them, it doesn't really make sense at the price point. It's the kind of thing you'd want to own if you're a higher end owner-operator who needs a camera that's both premium and tough at the same time, and that can fit into professional multicam workflows. But that test was just barely enough to get a basic feel for the Burano, and to actually see if it might be my next workhorse camera, I'm gonna need a lot more hands-on time with it. So I don't know, maybe I'll reach out to Sony in the next couple weeks and see if they'll let me borrow one for a bit. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see with a video like that, and what kind of tests you'd like me to put the Burano through, and maybe I can make it happen. So I hope that video was interesting, and ultimately the point here is that all the cameras are good at what they're made to do. What really matters is what you need it for. For some people, the FX3 is going to be a way better camera than an Alexa, and for other people, the exact opposite is going to be true. And for me, it's somewhere in the middle. So don't worry about what's best on paper, just get the right tool for the job. See ya.